This is my first time watching Season of the Witch, and by God, it is one of the worst movies I've seen. But I still enjoy the movie somewhat.
Yes, Season of the Witch is a very bad film, but I'm looking forward to watching it again. I haven't seen that movie in probably like 15 years. Because any time that in the past that I've decided to go through and sort of watch these films, I always skip that one. Yeah, from what I remember, I think that movie would be a decent horror film. I mean, maybe a mediocre to decent horror film outside of the context of the Halloween series, but it definitely doesn't fit in there. You can go from 2 to 4, and that movie is of no consequence. It doesn't contribute to the storyline. It's not part of the chronology. It's a useless film to have in there.
Yes, I know. The director of that film, he wanted to make an anthology series where each movie would be its own story, which it failed, and so they just went back to making it about Michael Myers.
So I watched Halloween today with my baby daughter. Well, she's not a baby; she's a toddler. She's 2, and like she was sitting with me just watching it. And every time Mike Myers showed up with his mask, she would say, "Oh no, oh no!" And she would run behind me and kind of hide behind me and suck on her thumb. But other than that, she didn't seem too upset about it. But she's terrified of Puppy Patrol. Like, Puppy Patrol scares her. Like, she'll sit there and she'll cry and scream and say, no, 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 no. But she's not scared of Mike Myers, or just only, like, marginally scared of Mike Myers.
What you gotta get Paw Patrol? Like, that's crazy. That's funny. Like, when you watch a film for the first time, you don't really notice some of the wrong things about the movie or some of the plot holes until later. Especially me being a 90s kid. I grew up in the 90s. I watched a bunch of movies, and I didn't realize that there's a lot of scenes in, like, example, like Forrest Gump that are more subliminal. And especially when it comes to Halloween, there's a lot of scenes I didn't notice that, like, that just didn't make sense.
I want to see a remake of Halloween with Alex Jones as Dr. Loomis. I don't even understand why he feels the obligation to take on that role. Like, he's not a police officer. He's not a criminal profiler, right? He's just a psychologist, right? Or a therapist of some sort. So he's not even qualified to do what he's doing. He's on this manhunt trying to hunt this guy down. And you're right, he's super paranoid the whole time. I mean, I guess he was right. I mean, they weren't unfounded conspiracies, but he was out of his element.
But you would think of him being a psychologist, like, he's seen some crazy people throughout his career, as paranoid schizophrenics or whatever, and he's dealing with this child who is going to be the serial killer, famous for, Michael Myers, and yeah, he acts like he's a conspiracy theorist, and that is a crazy take of Alex Jones being Dr. Loomis. I can completely see that, and like Dr. Loomis basically is Alex Jones in a way.
Now that I think about it, you're right. You're right about that. I never really looked at him like that before, but he did say that in the entire time that he was with the kid never spoke to him and never really did much of anything, but just sat there, and somehow he was able to come up with this like, I mean, but it wasn't a fantasy, was it? I mean, he was able to come up with this whole, well, I would call it a fantasy if it weren't true. This whole story about how horrible this child was, and he's pure evil, and you could see it in his eyes. But the reality is that he basically, I guess he just was somebody that went and checked up on this kid, but he definitely didn't do any psychoanalysis on him. If he didn't talk to him, if he never communicated with him, he had really no legitimate reason to believe any of the things that he was saying to the police about that kid.
Even so, like, I come to believe that Michael Myers at that point is just human. So even if Dr. Loomis is right, and Michael Myers is as evil as he says he is. Like, he's still human. He can still take a bullet. He can still be stabbed. He can still be killed. So he never mentions like what exactly this child did. He just says, "Oh, he has the devil in his eye." Well, okay. You haven't seen other patients, but yeah, he never mentions like how why he's evil or just because he didn't speak or is this kid immortal or can this kid breathe fire? Like, why should the entire town be afraid of this psycho when the police can easily take care of him? And he just acts like, oh, there's no stopping him. You don't understand. Blah 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 blah. He's like the only actor throughout the entire movie that's over the top, and he's over the top throughout the entire series, all the way from Halloween 5 to Halloween 6. He's basically the same character, and he never changes his story arc. He just stays one dimensional, just this intense like guy who always seems to be sweating, and he always for some reason seems to be wearing the same trench coat or whatever.
I don't know. Maybe he saw some things or that I don't remember because I haven't watched the series in a while. So maybe there's more later on. I guess you've watched the series more recently than I have, but throughout the first film, he sort of implies on multiple occasions when he's talking to the police that the guy is supernatural or that he's something that isn't human. I think he even says that he's not human at one point, doesn't he? And the last line of that film, my favorite part of the film is the last line he says, the girl, her name is escaping me right now. She says, was that the boogeyman? And Dr. Loomis says, yes. As a matter of fact, it was.
Yeah, that's probably the best line throughout the entire series, and I don't think it gets any better than that. There's no one-liners throughout the entire series that is as good as it. And yeah, the girl you mentioned, that is Laurie. Speaking of Laurie, Laurie is probably one of the most stupid, one of the more stupid female characters, because when you really think about it, she does a lot of stupid things in this movie, and you kind of question why she's even alive to begin with. Like, why didn't Michael Myers kill her? Because I had plenty of opportunities, because she made a lot of stupid moves, like putting the kids in the bathroom, or telling the kids to go to the other house, or turning her back to Michael Myers multiple times, at least 3 times as I count. But each time she turned her back, it was for at least a good 3 minutes.
I really like the way that some of the like 80s and early 90s films dealt with continuity among sequels. Like, for instance, the Back to the Future trilogy. You can watch that trilogy from beginning to end, and sort of, you could take the end of the first movie and you could blend it into the beginning of the second movie, and you could do the same thing with the second and the third movie. You could sort of edit them together so that they're seamless, edit the credits out, and you could just watch it as one full movie. And if you've never seen it before, you might not even be able to tell when one ends and the other one begins. I really like that. I feel like movies don't do that much anymore. I mean, I don't know a lot about recent, like, modern movies. So I don't know. I fell out of the movie scene a long time ago, but I really like Halloween 1 and 2. They are pretty much seamless. You could just edit them to be seamless together, you know? It'd be like a long, just a 3-hour movie.
Yeah, definitely. Halloween 1 and 2 can basically be the same movie. They didn't have to make them 2 separate movies. But the same thing can be said about the Friday the 13th series. Technically, the first 3 movies of Friday the 13th could have been the same movie. But thankfully, they actually did that in the last Friday the 13th movie, the remake. I think it was in 2010 or 11. One of the two. They basically put all 3 movies together in the same movie.
I really think that the common slasher genre was sort of started with Halloween, wasn't it? I mean, you could say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a slasher film, but the slasher film and like the 3 big slasher franchises were sort of all spawned from Halloween. You know, they all have a similar. I mean, they're different, but they have similar tropes. They have similar structures. You can definitely watch any of them from any of this series: Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and you can say, "Oh, just immediately, yeah, this is a slasher film," you know. they're like, I think of all of the genres out there, other than like avant-garde or like films with just intent that are intentionally structureless, slasher films they don't have plots, do they? Like, you've got this overarching plot that, everyone knows who the bad guy is, and he's got a backstory. And they get into just a little bit of the lives of the victims, but normally it's like, okay, we know the bad guy, and set all these victims up, put them all in circumstances where they're half naked and being sexually active, and but they're very shallow characters. They never really have much depth. And then dude comes and just picks them off one by one by one. And it's one of the only genres of film too that audiences are encouraged to identify with the bad guy and to not really have much empathy for the good guys, for the poor teenagers,
Yeah, Texas Chainsaw Massacre definitely kickstarted the slasher genre. I don't think it was actually the first slasher movie, but it definitely kickstarted it. And yeah, it was definitely Halloween that helped cemented movies like Friday the 13th or Child's Play, Nightmare on Elm Street. There was a big horror movie trope that came along with it. But also, every single horror movie had a typical theme. Like, all the immoral characters would die. The one African character... There would always be the one African character that would die and sometimes live. They even made a joke about this in the last Friday the 13th film. And...
I really think that the common slasher genre was sort of started with Halloween, wasn't it? I mean, you could say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a slasher film, but the slasher film and like the three big slasher franchises were sort of all spawned from Halloween. They all have a similar. I mean, they're different, but they have similar tropes. They have similar structures. Now, you can definitely watch any of them from any of their series: Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Friday the 13th. And you can say, oh, just immediately, yeah, this is a slasher film,
Yeah, horror movies were definitely different back in the 80s and 90s. And I often wonder what would have happened if the original Halloween was released today. It probably wouldn't have been considered a great film because at that particular time, it was considered a game changer. But when you really think about it, that movie isn't much in terms of story-wise, structure, and all that.
But going back to what you were saying, they do always make bad decisions, and they typically don't act rationally considering the circumstances. And I think you could argue that it's just because they're scared and they're in this situation that they've probably never been in this situation where they're being chased down by some dude in a mask trying to chop them into pieces and their friends are all dead. So maybe you might make irrational decisions because you're not thinking clearly. But I think the real reason is just because it gives people an opportunity to interact with the characters. Because, the people in the theaters will scream at the characters, don't go in there, don't do that. Look behind you. So it kind of, and also I think another thing is it helps you to not have as much empathy for the character when the character's acting really stupid. It's another way to sort of identify with the person that is the bad guy instead of identifying with the good guys.
Yeah, there's always the one character in old slasher movies that, like, they would always go down the dark hallway by themselves, or they would always go in the creepy old house by themselves. And there was always that one immoral character, whether they had sex with other characters or whether they just did a lot of drugs. And so always the immoral character dies, always... forgive my speech, sometimes the token character dies, and then the stupid character that tries to be brave dies.
Also, Psycho. Psycho predated Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And you sort of call that, I mean, it's not really a traditional, it doesn't have the traditional tropes and structure of a slasher film, but definitely there's some Psycho influence, I think, in the slasher films of the 80s and early 90s.
Oh yeah, I completely forgot about that movie. It's been so long since I've seen or heard about that movie. Yeah, Psycho was definitely probably the first actual slasher film. It was also probably the reason why it was such a game changer for the era it came out. I think it came out like maybe in the 40s or 50s, or I could be wrong. It doesn't matter, but yeah, definitely Alfred Hitchcock probably started the slasher series simply because of the movie Psycho. I never really thought of that, but yeah, Psycho was probably the first slasher movie.
Halloween, though, has really, really nice cinematography. I really like the shots. It's a very atmospheric film. It sets up a lot of tension. It's very tense. I think those things. I think John Carpenter is a good director. The music is excellent. The music is one of the most iconic. I think one of the most iconic songs in cinema history. It's up there with Jaws, the theme to Jaws, and the themes to Star Wars. You hear it and you immediately think of Mike Myers.
Yeah, that's true.
So those things are going for it. The acting is really bad. The script is pretty bad. There's not much of a coherent story, but it's a slasher film, so you kind of expect that. I mean, people didn't expect it back then because slasher films were not a thing. It was kind of it was a game changer in terms of that genre. It sort of jump started that genre.
Oh yeah, the movie is beautifully shot, especially if you, I think if you watch the original VHS version, because sometimes when you watch a movie from VHS to DVD, sometimes the quality is a little bit lacking. But yeah, it is beautifully shot. It is still somewhat of a low budget film. When you really think about it, there's a lot of low budget props. There's really not that many locations. The majority of the film takes place in like two houses, and then there's an asylum, but we never see the asylum. It's just on the back roads. There's really only like 6, maybe 7 locations throughout the entire film, so they probably didn't spend a whole lot of money on locations. And I know a lot about movies. I've actually worked in LA for about 3 years, and so some of those locations now wouldn't be that expensive to film, but if they had a big crew, I think they had a few million to make the movie, but that's definitely low budget for a movie like this.
Yeah, there's a movie called Cabin in the Woods. The Cabin in the Woods, I think is what it's called, which is an excellent horror film, and it gets into all of those just horror movie tropes. It actually is a very intelligent horror film that is disguised as a dumb movie. And I did not even realize what I was watching until like halfway through, and I was like, oh wow, this film actually is sort of making fun of the genre.
Yes, what I love about Cabin in the Woods, like, when I first heard about that movie, I didn't go see it immediately because, I was taken back from the title. But when I actually sat back one day and actually watched it, I was like, oh, this movie is making fun of horror films. And Thor's in it, and Thor dies a stupid death. And there's a joke throughout the entire film how the main bad guy wants there to be a merman. And there's a joke that the pothead character always dies, but yet the pothead character is the one that lives at the end of the film.
Actually, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure Jamie Lee Curtis was the woman that came out at the very end of Cabin in the Woods and explained the whole horror movie trope thing and explained to the characters what was going on and sort of like described which trope each character was and talked about the monsters or whatever that were underneath the ground. I don't exactly remember how. I'd have to watch it again to talk about it coherently. But that was Jamie Lee Curtis, right?
I haven't seen Cabin in the Woods in a long time, so I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch that. I guess it probably was Jamie Lee Curtis, but I'm not 100% sure. I remember there's a scene in Cabin in the Woods where they kind of do a nod to Hellraiser. There's a monster that has like a cube, and he's sitting there staring blankly at the characters, and I think that is a nod to Hellraiser. And there's a couple other nods, like the It clown. There's a clown in it, and there's a couple other slasher monsters in it.
Oh, I looked up the Halloween page on Wikipedia. So Halloween, the original John Carpenter Halloween, came out in 1978, October 25th, 1978. It had a budget of $325,000, so less,
Whoa.
Significantly less than $500,000, and it made $47 million in the United States, 23 million foreign and 70 million worldwide.
Wow.
That's box office revenue.
Wow, that is insane. I was expecting it to be at least 2 or 3 million. But there is something else to consider, that the U.S. currency was actually stronger back then. So I'm guessing that if they had over $300,000, it probably was the equivalent of maybe a million today. Because, like I said, back in the 70s, U.S. currency was worth a lot more way back then. Regardless, that is still insane that it was still only made for 300,000. Like, that is, like, I was expecting a million. Like I said, like, I did not expect that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of monsters at the end of that film. They come out. Don't they end up destroying the world at the end? I think everybody dies, right? I don't remember. I'd have to watch it again. I saw that like 3 or 4 years ago. Hellraiser is another series of films that. Oh man, I could talk a lot about those. Those are really, really dark movies, though. And I don't know if you've ever read any of Clive Barker's books, but he wrote one of the greatest fantasy novels that I've ever read.
This may come as a surprise to some people, but I am somewhat educated. I've been to college 2 times. I've been to college 3 times. That may seem irrelevant, but actually I do read a lot of books. I'm 90% sure I've read a Clive Barker book at least once, but I'm not sure which book I've read. And also, to be brutally honest, I've actually never watched a single Hellraiser movie. I think I tried to get into it when I was younger. Well, I don't know. That's something I'm definitely going to watch like next after I'm done with the Halloween films. Or maybe we can go about and talk about Ernest. Well, we'll get to that later.
It's called Imagica. Either Imagica or Imagica. I don't know how to say it. But I like Imagica because it's a self-contained book. Instead of like having 13 volumes of a fantasy series, it's just a really big book, but it's only one book. It's extremely dark. It's very, very well written. It has a really nice story. It's really, really strange, very violent. But it's a great fantasy series. And I always recommend that book for anybody because I feel like a lot of people don't know about Imagica. Even people who know Clive Barker. Yeah, it's a really good book. I'm going off subject. But yeah, man, Hellraiser, Jesus, those films are dark. And the books are really dark.
It's not too far off subject. It's still about slasher films, which is the topic we're on right now. So it's no big deal. I mean, it's still relevant. You know, Clive Barker, Hellraiser, still because we're still talking about the Halloween movie.
So Halloween 2, 1981. It came out also right before Halloween. It came out October 30th, 1981. The budget for that one was $2.5 million. And it made $25 million in the U.S. And it was only in the U.S. It's $25,533,818 in the U.S. But that's pretty good. So they got a much bigger budget for the second film. The second film doesn't really have. I'm only halfway through a rewatch of the second film right now, but it doesn't really have a lot more pizzazz than the first film. I mean, a lot of it is shot in a hospital, but that's a pretty.
It also sounds like the second film didn't make as much money as the first film, and that's weird because since they have a bigger budget, but I guess that's what happens when studios get in the way of directors and their original vision. This actually happens a lot in movies nowadays where a director has a certain vision of how he wants the movie to be, but when the studio gets involved, like the vision kind of dies down. Like, it's weird because even though they had a bigger budget for Halloween 2, I still felt like the quality in the second film was not as good of a quality as the first film.
The Hellraiser films are about pain and like sadomasochism, and they're pretty dark. They're definitely not fun films. Like with Halloween and any of the slasher movies are fun. They're dark and they're violent and they're horror films, but they still kind of maintain that sense of just there's a lightheartedness to the darkness, especially with the Nightmare on Elm Street films. They're not just totally dark. And the Hellraiser films are really dark. And the comedy that's in those, like, there's comedy, like, they always make bad puns, and Pinhead always says really, like, ridiculous shit. He always makes bad jokes. But they're just very unsettling. They're unsettling films. And they kind of get redundant after a while. But all these movies get redundant after a while. Like 10 Halloween movies. How many Jason movies were there? I think 11. I think they've made 11 of those movies.
Yeah, I don't remember how many Jason movies they made. They definitely made at least 10 of them. And there was one, like a long time ago, I think in Friday the 13th, 9, or maybe it was 5, where they actually show Freddy Krueger's hand. And for like almost 10 years, people were asking for a Freddy versus Jason movie, and we finally get that. But yeah, I definitely never seen any of the Hellraiser movies yet, but that's definitely something I'm going to consider since I'm starting this new series. Because, yeah, I do got to catch up on some of my old slasher movies.
I want to read the summary of the Halloween franchise Wikipedia, the summary at the beginning, to give anyone listening to this an idea of how big this franchise is. Halloween is an American horror franchise that consists of 10 films, novels, comic books, merchandise, and a video game. A video game. I didn't even know that there was a video game. Collectively, the films have grossed over $366 million at the box office worldwide. The film series is ranked 4th at the United States box office in adjusted 2008 dollars when compared to other American horror franchises. So it's one of the top 5 grossing horror franchises in American history.